Hello, and welcome to my review of Tarnsman of Gor by John Norman. First published in the UK anyway, in 1969, Tarnsman of Gor began the Gorean Cycle or series, sometimes also referred to as the Counter-Earth Saga. I picked this up because while I was reading the Elric Saga, I discovered that Michael Moorcock campaigned against these books because of their objectification of women. I wanted to see what the fuss was about, particularly as the era these books came from, and the genre generally, certainly until recently, not exactly known for being progressive. That said, I also reviewed Le Guin's Wizard of Earthsea fairly recently, and that actually predates the Gor series. While you'd have to be completely uninformed to consider Le Guin a misogynist, her world does depict a number of places, including the wizard school attended by the hero, where women are excluded. So what makes that commentary and this exploitative? Gor begins very much in the Barosian tradition with an English professor called Tal Cabot. He's already somewhat out of his element teaching in America. Norman then develops the fish out of water theme twofold, with Tal deciding to camp overnight in the mountains and then being drawn from there to his father on Gor. Gor is a counter-Earth which mimics our own orbit completely, but on the opposite side of the sun. Cabot narrates his own tale in the first person, and his style initially certainly recalls his job as a professor. The slightly stiff formality of the narrative tone reminds me a fair bit of H.P. Lovecraft, especially early on when unexplained and mysterious things are happening. For the first time since I had opened the envelope, I began to lose control. The compass had been my anchor and trust. I had counted on it. Now it had gone crazy. There was a loud noise, but I think it might have been the sound of my own voice, a sudden frightened shriek for which I shall always bear the shame. As the novel progresses and the story picks up, this becomes slightly less striking. After arriving on Gor, Tal gets a crash course in Gor history, lessons in swordsmanship, the Gorean language down to the irrelevant etymology of his own words, and a few other subjects as well. These lessons take up 3 or 4 chapters and include some truly horrible dialogue like this. I must speak to you of the priest-kings, but let me begin in my own way, that you may better understand the nature of that whereof I speak. At the end of this section, I was very much of the opinion that Moorcock was barking up the wrong tree. He should have been campaigning against these books because they were awful. However, when school is finally out, things then begin to pick up again. Tal has to learn how to fly a Tarn, the birds that you can see on the cover here. When he achieves this, he's then given the supposedly impossible mission of travelling to the city of the world's imperialist and dangerous warrior king and stealing their homestone, an act that would cause the warlord to lose such faith his allegiances would probably collapse. Norman never quite gets his action scenes right, and this first one is a good example of this, with the over-punctuated competing with other sections that, continuing the didactic tone of the schooling section, read something like entries from an encyclopedia. My first impression was that of a rush of giant wind and a great snapping sound, as if a giant might be snapping an enormous towel or scarf. Then I was cowering, awe-stricken, in a great winged shadow, and an immense Tarn, his talons extended like gigantic steel hooks, his wings sputtering fiercely in the air, hung above me, motionless apart from the beating of its wings. And that's fairly hard to read, I think. There's too many clauses and phrases jumbled up for it to really flow. Just a little bit of tidying up, and I think that it works better, like so. There was a rush of wind and a great snapping sound, as if a giant might be snapping an enormous towel or scarf. Awe-stricken, I was cowering in a great winged shadow. The immense Tarn hung above me, his talons extended like gigantic steel hooks, his wings sputtering fiercely in the air. I think that the snapping of the scarf is a pretty bad metaphor as well, especially when snapping bones is immediately more effective for creating fear and exaggerating a sense of size or power. 2 paragraphs later we get this anyway. Though the Tarn, like most birds, is surprisingly light for its size, this primarily having to do with the comparative hollowness of its bones, it is an extremely powerful bird, powerful even from what one would expect from such a monster. Whereas larger earth birds, such as the eagle, must, when taking flight from the ground, begin with a running start, the Tarn, with its incredible musculature, aided undoubtedly by the somewhat light gravity of Gor, can, with a spring and a sudden flurry of its wings, lift both itself and its rider into the air. In Gorean, these birds are sometimes spoken of as brothers of the wind. And the section actually continues in the same vein, certainly failing to make the scene very exciting, even if the biology of Tarns actually interests you. Tarnsman of Gor truly picks up with the introduction of Talena, the fiery daughter of the warlord. A curious thing to consider about a series decried for its sexism. Gorean customs dictate that Tal should have killed Talena, but fish out of water that he is, he instead takes her with him when he steals the homestone. What follows then is the two of them sparring, verbally mostly, as Tal attempts to make his way back home. Talena is from the petulant and entitled variety of princess, and her attempts to flee give way to attempts to cause Tal problems every time their paths cross another traveller. Eventually, those travellers become warriors and warlords determined to bring war to the capital now that the big warlord has lost his homestone. There certainly is an effective raising of the stakes in this section, and of the heroism involved. It is also fairly obvious where the Tal and Talena relationship is going, but for all that, again, I found them to be reasonable leads, certainly entertaining enough to carry this book. For all the talk of sexism around these novels, this one at least has what I'd consider the prototype for a lot of more modern and a lot more awful strong female leads. She certainly has the measure of Tal, even if he does have the strength and skill to win all of the scrapes that she puts him in. Quite a few of those scrapes, though, show where the series gets its reputation from. There is considerably more mention of female slaves than male. Likewise, we learn little about the free women at all beyond that they exist, and that they are subject to the same caste system with its limited social mobility as the men. Tal, though, thanks to his perspective, frequently acts or speaks out against the worst of the society's rules, including pledging to abolish slavery. The rest of the society, though, suggests that slavery is okay, or even good for some. That sort of position, usually opposed by the hero, I did find objectionable. But at the same time, depicting a situation is not the same as endorsing it, and Tal, as our protagonist, remains both reasonable and likeable, in part by his going against the rules of the world. What could I tell her? That I had come from another world, that I was determined that all the ways of Gor should not be mine. That said, the ways of Gor are pretty horrific. The casual indication from Tarn's father that slaves can be taken at will sets this tone early. When Sana, a slave girl, is required for Tal's mission, she is drugged, bound, and fitted with a fully enclosed slave hood for the journey, completely gratuitous given that she was perfectly willing to go on the mission, seeking revenge as she was for the violence her own city had suffered. After an early squabble with Talena, she begs Tal not to rape her, and we later learn that he had intended to, momentarily at least. Apparently those are the ways of this world, but it's still pretty toxic stuff. Talena calls him a coward for not going through with it, and after he tries to abandon her and leave her to her own devices, she uses Gorean customs to force him into taking her as a slave and thereby protect her. Laughing at her own resourcefulness, though, amounts to laughing at her own enslavement. Despite her predicament, Talena remains sufficiently haughty to prompt a number of witnesses to suggest Tal whip her. He refuses, of course. The section I think that will enrage more people than any other is where they work out the details of her slavery, and Talena is forced to wear a collar announcing that she is his property. Her life as a slave, though, actually affords her slightly more freedom than her life as a princess did, confined as she was by being veiled and limited to the Gorean Cycle. This real-world commentary features a handful of times in the text, dealing with not just Greek mythology but also Darwinian concepts, and again in a section that might well offend quite a few, comparing the activity of the slave market with the more modern, for 1969, dating practices. Though that comparison actually seems more relevant in the Twitter age, it will certainly raise an eyebrow or a hackle or two. As the situation on Gor spirals out of control and various warlords lay siege to the city, the political situation gets more intriguing, and Tal's attempts to rescue Talena get more desperate, so things do get more engrossing, and this turns into a fairly good fantasy novel by the end. Norman's prose never really does much to up the ante, remaining largely professorial throughout, but there are enough characters, including Talena, to care about that the fetish stuff takes a background as the action builds, so therefore does the enjoyment. The last act, but not the preceding two, is almost on a similar sort of level to something like The Black Company by Glenn Cook. In conclusion, the sexism and the depiction of slavery, sexual or otherwise, in this book is fairly toxic. Probably only those belonging to a certain sexual subculture would read this and 50 Shades of Grey, but it's hard not to see them as originating from the same sort of inspiration. If you can shake off that mental shudder, you'll find Tarnsman of Gor to be nothing like as expected. A maxim which holds true about just about every aspect of it. The plot is better than expected, the characters are better than expected, the quality of writing is better than expected. The relationship between Tal and Talena is probably the focus of the book, motivating Tal as it does, even when the two are separated. Not even 1% as explicit as 50 Shades of Grey. They are a much more engaging couple than Steele and Grey. When not veering towards abuse, or if I'm being generous, BDSM, their relationship is a quite reasonable, occasionally enjoyable, transition from sparring to affection. Tarnsman of Gor might be laden with what is now a slightly dated narrative style, but Gorman has a decent eye for a character, I think. There is, that sleaze aside, also a smattering of things to enjoy, and maybe even like about Tarnsman of Gor. If the series had a better reputation, sufficiently so that I could expect the unpleasantness to be toned down going forward, I wouldn't actually object to reading more of these. There's very nearly a recommendation there for fantasy fans, but consider that reputation before you decide if this is for you. As it is, there are certainly plenty more Elric books that I haven't read, and more from the Black Company too. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and check out some of the other videos while you're here.